In September 1939, just 3 weeks into World War II, Admiral John Godfrey, Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, circulated a memo that would echo far beyond its time. Godfrey was a hard-driving, irascible man who loved fly fishing for trout, and he saw the business of deceiving the enemy in precisely those terms. The memo, co-authored by his personal assistant, a young lieutenant commander named Ian Fleming, laid out 51 schemes for bamboozling the Germans. Most were too fantastic to ever attempt, but buried deep in the list was idea number 28. It was not a very nice one. The two men proposed taking a corpse dressed as an airman, dropping it with false documents onto the enemy coast, and letting the Germans find it. They had borrowed the notion from a forgotten detective novel by a former spy catcher named Basil Thompson. It was a seed planted in cold ground. 3 years later, in September 1942, that seed received its first watering. A British Catalina seaplane flying from Plymouth to Gibraltar crashed in a violent storm off the coast of Cadiz in southwest Spain. Among the dead was Paymaster Lieutenant James Haddon Turner, a Royal Navy courier carrying a letter revealing the date of the planned invasion of North Africa. The bodies washed ashore and were recovered by the Spanish authorities. For 24 hours, the letter lay in Turner's pocket before being turned over to the British consul. The question haunted Allied intelligence: had the Germans seen it? Scientists flew to Gibraltar and examined both the body and the documents. They found sand in the buttonholes of Turner's coat, rubbed in when the corpse drifted onto the beach. That sand, they concluded, would have been disturbed if the coat had been opened and refastened. The secret was safe. But the lesson was unmistakable. A body could carry secrets to the enemy, and the enemy might believe them. Only weeks after the Catalina crash, on October 31, 1942, a lanky flight lieutenant named Charles Cholmondeley stood before the 20 Committee, the top-secret body that oversaw Britain's double agents. Cholmondeley suffered from poor eyesight and had been grounded from flying, so he poured his restless imagination into covert work instead. He was a man who restored antique cars, studied insect mating habits, and hunted partridge with a revolver. Now he presented a plan he called Trojan Horse. It proposed obtaining a corpse from a London hospital, dressing it in uniform, filling the lungs with water, and dropping it from an aircraft into enemy waters. The committee listened. The idea was audacious, but one member raised a crucial objection. If the body was dropped from a plane, any autopsy would detect the injuries inflicted after death. Catholic countries, however, had a traditional aversion to cutting open the dead, and Spain, neutral but leaning toward the Axis, was exactly the sort of place where the documents would be handed straight to the Germans. A new name for the operation was eventually chosen, one that reflected the dark humor of the men planning it. They called it Mincemeat. In January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt agreed on what everyone with a map already suspected: Sicily would be the next Allied target. The island commanded the Mediterranean, and taking it would open the road to Rome and perhaps knock Italy out of the war. But the logic was so obvious that Churchill himself admitted everyone but a bloody fool would know it was Sicily. If the Germans reinforced the island, the invasion could turn into a bloodbath. The Allied chiefs knew they would need more than brute force. They would need to make the enemy believe they were going somewhere else, anywhere else. Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Bevan of the London Controlling Section was ordered to devise a comprehensive deception plan, code-named Operation Barclay, to convince the Germans that Greece and Sardinia were the real targets. And into that broader scheme, a smaller, stranger piece now needed to fit. The charred seed planted 4 years earlier in a fisherman's memo was about to sprout. But to bring it to life, 2 men in a smoke-filled basement room would first need to find a dead body. On January 28, 1943, a 34-year-old Welsh drifter named Glyndwr Michael died in a London hospital. He had swallowed rat poison, a desperate act in a life marked by poverty, illiteracy, and mental illness. His body was unclaimed, his family unaware and uncaring. But in the St. Pancras mortuary, Coroner Bentley Purchase saw an opportunity. He contacted Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of Naval Intelligence, who had been searching for exactly such a corpse. Purchase offered the body for what he called a warlike operation, and Montague accepted without hesitation. Montague and Charles Cholmondeley now set to work transforming the dead vagrant into a credible British officer. They gave him a name, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. They dressed him in a uniform that Cholmondeley himself wore for months to give it the right patina of use. The identity card bore a photograph, not of Michael, but of MI5 officer Ronnie Reed, whose face closely resembled the dead man's. The card was deliberately endorsed, issued in lieu of number 09650 lost, to explain its newness. Every detail was calculated to withstand German scrutiny. The planners built a whole life around Major Martin. They forged letters from his stern father, John C. Martin, discussing an overdue overdraft and his cousin Priscilla's unfortunate looks. They created a dunning note from Lloyd's Bank demanding payment of £79. But Martin needed a romantic interest, so Montagu asked the prettiest secretary in MI5 for a photograph. Jean Leslie, just 20 years old, provided a bathing suit picture taken on a riverbank. She became Pam, Martin's whirlwind fiancée, and the photo was tucked into his wallet. The love letters were drafted by Hester Leggett, a spinster secretary who poured all her unexpressed emotion into Pam's girlish scrawl. "Bill, darling, do let me know as soon as you get fixed," one letter read, "and don't please let them send you off into the blue." A bill for an expensive diamond ring from S.J. Phillips of New Bond Street was added, along with 2 ticket stubs from Sid Field's show Strike a New Note, dated April 22nd. These would prove Martin was still in London just days before his supposed death. The entire packet of pocket litter was designed to be irresistible, too personal to be a plant. But where should Martin's body wash ashore? The planners needed a place where German spies could easily intercept the documents. Assistant Naval Attaché Salvador Gomez Bear identified the perfect spot, Huelva, on Spain's southwest coast. There, the German Vice Consul Adolf Kloss ran a spy network so efficient that nothing moved along the coast without his knowledge. Kloss bribed harbor officials, police chiefs, and lighthouse keepers. He photographed every ship that passed and relayed the information to Berlin. Huelva was crawling with German agents, and the local Spanish authorities were openly pro-Axis. Gomez Bear knew Kloss personally and described him as active and influential, and a pleasure to outwit. The British consulate in Huelva under Francis Hasselden would play its part by appearing anxious about the missing briefcase. Meanwhile, the body would be dropped just offshore, where Kloss's informants would surely find it. The trap was set. The man who never was would soon float into German hands, carrying lies that could change the course of the war. While Montagu and Cholmondeley perfected the pocket litter in London, a parallel secret played out in the shadows. Ivor Montagu, Ewan's brother, continued to pass classified intelligence to Soviet handlers under the code name Agent Intelligentsia. Min-5 surveillance logs noted his contacts with Soviet embassy staff, and the risk that a single leak could unravel the mincemeat operation was very real. Yet Ewan Montagu remained unaware that his own sibling was working against the same war effort he now served. MI5 intensified its watch, but took no overt action, anxious that an arrest could accidentally expose the mincemeat operation to German surveillance. The two worlds remained separate, but the collision was uncomfortably close. By mid-April, with Churchill's approval secured, the trickiest piece of the forgery was ready, the official letters that would carry the deception. General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, drafted a personal letter to General Harold Alexander. The letter had to sound casual, almost chatty, while clearly pointing toward Greece as the next Allied target and Sicily as a mere cover. Every sentence was weighed, every phrase tested, to ensure no German analyst would suspect a plant. Lord Louis Mountbatten contributed a second letter to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the Mediterranean commander. In it, Mountbatten described Major Martin as a staff officer who really knows his stuff and ended with a joke. He might bring some sardines with him. They are on points here. The joke was labored, but Montagu argued that the Germans would take it as a typically English hint that the attack would fall on Sardinia. The letter was signed, sealed with wax, and its edges photographed to detect any tampering. In Madrid, Captain Alan Hilgarth, Britain's naval attaché, prepared the Spanish end of the deception. Hilgarth had spent years bribing Spanish generals and running agents inside the Franco regime to keep Spain out of the war. Now he mobilized his most valuable asset, a senior Spanish naval officer codenamed Andros, who had already fed false intelligence to the SS. Andros would help ensure that any documents the Germans found would be taken seriously. Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the Abwehr's espionage chief in Madrid, was the ideal recipient for the hoax. Kulenthal had already swallowed the Garbo double agent's fabrications whole. He was ambitious, insecure about his Jewish ancestry, and desperate to prove his worth to Berlin. Hilgarth knew that Kulenthal believed whatever his agents told him, and that he would pass the mincemeat documents upstairs without serious scrutiny. The trap was set for a man who craved success more than truth. On the morning of Thursday, April 15th, Johnny Bevan of the London Controlling Section sat on Winston Churchill's bed and outlined Operation Mincemeat. Churchill, in his dressing gown, puffed his cigar and asked whether the plan could fail. Bevan admitted the body might never wash ashore, or the Spanish might hand it straight back. Churchill grinned. In that case, we shall have to get the body back and give it another swim. He approved the scheme. A coded telegram to General Eisenhower in Algiers brought an immediate reply. General Eisenhower gives full approval mincemeat. The forged letters were placed in an ordinary black government briefcase, chained to the corpse's belt. The body now packed in dry ice inside a steel canister marked optical instruments, waited in a Hackney mortuary. A Fordson van driven by the racing driver, Jock Horsfall, stood ready to carry the cargo 400 miles north to Scotland. Operation Mincemeat was about to leave dry land. On the night of April 17, 1943, a Fordson van pulled away from Hackney Mortuary in London. At the wheel was Jock Horsfall, a champion racing driver who moonlighted as an MI5 chauffeur. In the back, packed in dry ice inside a steel tube marked optical instruments, lay the body of Glyndwr Michael, now dressed as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. Beside Horsfall sat Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley, the two intelligence officers who had spent months building the dead man's identity. The van pushed north through the blackout toward the River Clyde, where a submarine waited. By midday on April 18th, the 400-pound canister had been lowered through the torpedo hatch of HMS Seraph. Lieutenant Bill Jewell, the submarine's commander, had been briefed on the operation in London and knew his orders: carry the body to the Spanish coast, slip it into the sea at the right current and tide, and vanish. The crew was told the canister held a secret meteorological device. One torpedo was left behind to make room. For the next 10 days, the men of Seraph would sleep just feet from a dead man they did not know they were carrying. On the evening of April 22nd, Montague and Jean Leslie, the young MI5 secretary whose photograph had become Major Martin's fiancée Pam, attended a variety show at the Prince of Wales Theatre. The comedian Sid Field was headlining in Strike a New Note. Montague had bought 4 tickets and torn out the 2 middle stubs. Those counterfoils, dated April 22nd, were now tucked inside the dead man's trench coat as evidence that he had spent his last night in London celebrating. The Germans would find them and calculate that the only way Major Martin could have reached Spain by April 30th was by plane. Montague and Leslie ate dinner afterward at the Gargoyle Club in Soho. They were joined by Cholmondeley and another secretary, Avril Gordon. The conversation was light, but Montague kept checking his watch. 600 miles away, Jewell was steering Seraph south through the Atlantic swell. The farewell party was a performance for anyone watching, a final piece of theater to reinforce the fiction. The next morning, Montague wrote to his wife in New York, describing the show as a thoroughly good evening, saying nothing of what the ticket stubs were about to do. At 4:15 on the morning of April 30th, Jewell brought Seraph to periscope depth off Punta Umbria, a strip of beach near the port of Huelva. The wind was light and southerly, ideal for carrying the body ashore. The canister was hauled through the torpedo hatch and opened on deck. The face of Glyndwr Michael was darkened by mold and beginning to break apart. Jewell inflated the life jacket, fastened the briefcase chain to the belt, selected one of 3 identity cards, and slid the body over the side. The empty canister, riddled with bullets and packed with plastic explosive, was detonated and sank into the deep water. He bent his head and recited what he could remember of the funeral service. Then he ordered full speed astern. At mid-morning, a local fisherman named Jose Antonio Rey Maria spotted a lump in the water off La Bota Beach. He rowed over and found a dead man in a khaki uniform, face down, a yellow life jacket holding him at the surface. A black briefcase was chained to the body. Jose hauled the corpse onto his boat and dragged it up onto the sand. The children of Punta Umbria gathered to stare. A Spanish naval judge, Mariano Pascual del Pobil, arrived by canoe, made a brief examination, and took custody of the locked briefcase. The body was loaded onto a donkey and carried to the port. Major William Martin had arrived in Spain. On the 1st of May, the Spanish naval commander of Huelva port handed the locked briefcase to Adolf Claus, who immediately summoned a photographer. Claus knew this was his greatest catch of the war. The photographs he took showed letters that pointed unmistakably toward Greece as the next Allied target, with Sicily dismissed as mere cover. The sardines joke in Mountbatten's letter seemed to confirm Sardinia as the real Western objective. Claus sealed the photographs in a diplomatic pouch and dispatched them to the German embassy in Madrid by special courier. In the Abwehr offices on the Calle de Alcalá, Major Karl Erich Kuhlenthal received the package with barely concealed excitement. Here was proof that his network in Spain had delivered the intelligence coup of the Mediterranean campaign. He did not pause to question how a dead courier happened to be carrying such sensitive material so close to German-controlled waters. He read the letters, saw confirmation of what he already wanted to believe, and transmitted the contents to Berlin within hours. On the 11th of May, the Spanish authorities returned the original documents to the British vice-consul in Huelva, sealed and apparently untouched. The seals were intact, just as Montagu had hoped, but the British knew better. The microscopic photographs taken of the wax seals before departure had already revealed the truth. The seals had been carefully pried open, copied, and resealed. The Germans had swallowed the bait whole. In London, the team in room 13 waited for the German reaction with the anxious patience of anglers watching a float. Montagu later wrote that those days were the longest of his life. There was no way to know if the deception had worked, only an agonizing silence from the other side of the intelligence fence. Then the ultra-intercepts began to arrive. The decoded German signals told a story more perfect than any spy could have scripted. On the 12th of May, Hitler personally ordered the 1st Panzer Division to redeploy from France to Greece. Additional troops were rushed to Sardinia and the Aegean Islands. The Führer had accepted the false intelligence as genuine, believing the main blow would fall on the eastern Mediterranean. The defenses of Sicily, the real target, were now critically weakened. Kuhlenthal's stock in Berlin rose higher than ever. He was commended for his network's brilliant work, promoted and praised by Canaris himself. No one in the Abwehr questioned the source of the intelligence. The Golden Boy of Madrid had delivered the scoop of the war. The British watched through their intercepts as Kuhlenthal basked in the glory of his own credulity. The German High Command now believed that the main Allied blow would fall on Greece and Sardinia, with a likely attack on the Peloponnese. Panzer divisions that might have turned the beaches of Sicily into a slaughter ground were stationed hundreds of miles away. The soft underbelly of the Axis had become genuinely soft. On the 10th of July, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted struck the shores of Sicily. 160,000 British, American, and Commonwealth troops stormed ashore under cover of darkness. The German defenders, stripped of reinforcements, fought bravely but were overwhelmed. The island fell in 38 days with casualties far lighter than anyone had dared to predict. Montagu received the news with a mixture of relief and quiet exhilaration. The gamble had paid off. A dead Welsh tramp, a forged identity, and a handful of clever letters had diverted Hitler's defenses at the decisive moment. Tens of thousands of young men were alive who would have died on those beaches if the deception had failed. The secret held for the remainder of the war. The Germans continued to believe the deception and only learned how thoroughly they had been fooled when Montagu's account was published years later. By then, the operation had already passed into the quiet annals of intelligence legend. The story remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Montagu, bound by the Official Secrets Act, could tell no one, not even his wife, the full extent of what he had done. The grave of Major William Martin in Huelva was maintained with quiet honor, a silent monument to a man who had never existed. In 1953, Montagu published The Man Who Never Was, a carefully censored account of the deception that revealed just enough to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the remaining secrets. The book became an international sensation, adapted into a film and translated into dozens of languages. The world finally learned how a dead Welsh drifter had helped win a war. The grave in Huelva remained a place of pilgrimage for decades. Local people tended it, laying flowers and telling the story of the British officer who had washed ashore with his mysterious briefcase. Not until the late 1990s did the British government finally acknowledge the truth by adding Glyndwr Michael's own name to the headstone. Montagu retired from naval intelligence after the war, returned to his legal practice, and later served as a judge. He died in 1985, taking many of the operation's deepest secrets to his grave. It was only when his son discovered the locked trunk of papers under a bed in Oxford that the full, uncensored story of Mincemeat could finally be told. Today, the operation stands as the most successful strategic deception in military history. A handful of men in a smoke-filled basement, armed with imagination, audacity, and a lawyer's attention to detail, fooled the most powerful intelligence service in Europe at the height of its power. They did it not with armies or weapons, but with ink, paper, and a single human life given over to a cause he never knew he served. The deception's architects dispersed into quiet and varied peacetimes. Charles Cholmondeley returned to intelligence work, his restless imagination finally channeled into routine. Alan Hilgarth was knighted and retired to the Scottish Highlands to write. Adolf Kloss was expelled from Spain by the Allies, his spy network shattered. Jean Leslie married and raised a family, carrying the secret of Pam with grace. Bentley Purchase continued as coroner until his death, remembered for his unflagging good humor and his collection of toy trains. Salvador Gomez Baer settled in Gibraltar. Bill Jewell left the sea for the land, becoming a farmer. Francis Hazelden returned to Huelva, where he quietly tended the grave of the man he had helped bury. If you have family stories from the Mediterranean campaign, or memories of the Sicily landings passed down through your own bloodline, we would be honored if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one and they keep this history alive. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support allows us to continue telling these forgotten stories of courage, cunning, and sacrifice. Thank you for listening.